It is October the 15th, 2008, and this is an interview in Allen, Texas with Lieutenant Colonel John Smith. And thank you very much for letting me interview you.
You're more than welcome, for whatever it's worth.
Okay. Well, now, I met you because you're Billy Smith's brother, Colleen Altaffer Smith's brother-in-law.
Right.
And they're both alums of what's now Texas A&M Commerce. And I've known them both for, well, since Colleen was in high school and since Billy first arrived at East Texas State. And I've been friends with them ever since. And that was in the early 1970s, about 74, 73, somewhere along there.
Yes.
And where were you born?
I was born in Galveston, Texas.
And
in 1941, April 27th, 1941, at St. Mary's Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore. And I just only recently realized that I was baptized a Catholic when I was born.
Oh, really?
Well, I think that all the sisters and all the Catholic hospitals always baptized the babies when they were born. So I didn't realize how easy it is to baptize someone. But apparently, my son was baptized at the age of 4 by one of his friends who was also 4, who was Catholic, who was concerned that my son had never been baptized, brought some holy water home, sprinkled on him, and he has since been told that that's a legitimate Catholic baptism. So it's pretty easy to be baptized Catholic. Pretty hard to live up to it, probably. But
it's probably harder to live up to it than the actual process. Now, I myself was dunked. You know, I was raised a Baptist, and thought I was going to go directly to heaven because I was an elderly preacher, and we had a big water tank behind the choir loft, and I didn't think he was ever going to raise me up.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in the Church of Christ, and that was very similar to the way they baptized in the Church of Christ. You know.
I also learned a very valuable lesson. Now I think it's cheating. They probably have the water heated, and I got the calling in January, I think, and there was no heat in the water. And
that was one way of ensuring that baptism gave you goosebumps, wasn't it?
It sure did. It was cold, and also I felt like he was cheating because he was wearing hip waders, and I wasn't.
Yeah, that's not fair. Absolutely not fair. How old were you?
Well, I was about 8 years old, and was a horrible sinner. So I wanted to make sure I didn't spend all of eternity in hell for all the transgressions that I had done in that 8 years. And so when did you move from Galveston?
Oh, my parents lived at on a fishing camp, Camp Smith, which my father's mother and father owned down in San Leon, Texas. My dad was a graduate of Texas A&M. He graduated with a degree in chemical engineering, but he was totally deaf all of his life, and he was unable to get a job. So as a result, he ended up working for his parents down there on the fishing camp. And he built the camp fundamentally, and then became a shrimped for bait. And they lived there in a little cottage, one of the little cottages that he built, as I understand it. And at the age of about 1, he had a cousin. We have a lot of old family down in Bryan, Texas. Some of the original settlers down in that area. And he had a cousin down there that convinced him to come to Bryan, thought he could get him a job. So they moved to Bryan, Texas, and Dad went to work for an agricultural poison plant. They used to do fertilizers and insecticides. But he fundamentally was a labor. They had him shoveling chemicals together to make these large quantities, and it did a lot of damage to him. He was really eaten up with a lot of problems, and later in his life he died of cancer, and I believe probably that was one of the big contributing factors, was the few years that he worked there. So we moved to Bryan in about 1942, as I would guess, because I was only about a year old at the time, so I wouldn't know for sure. And then later, when the war broke out, the mom and dad both ended up working at Bryan Air Force Base, which was a training base for the Air Force that they opened up at that time frame. He was an instrument mechanic for aircraft, and Mom worked in administration.
You mentioned that some of your family were the early pioneers that were settled in the Bryan area. Do you know their names or when they arrived there?
I'm not certain. I've tried to look into it, but with a name like Smith, it's a little hard to find the history, as you can imagine. But they settled in. There was a bunch that came out of Georgia, out of the Oglethorpe area in Georgia, and there's 3 or 4 different areas in Georgia called Oglethorpe. One's a county, and 2 or 3 little towns. Oglethorpe was a famous guy, you may be familiar with him, who led a colony from Savannah, I think, shortly after the Revolutionary War, into the Georgia area and settled in that area. And they settled in an old area called Reliance, Texas. There's not much there anymore. There's an old church called the Reliance Church, Baptist Church, and many of the families buried back there behind the old Reliance Church. And they were there in around the 1850s to 1890 time frame was probably when they came into that area. And then my grandmother, my dad's mother, came from a family called of Zimmermans, and Shaws were their background. And she was born in Curtin, Texas, which is a little town. Not much there either, but it's about 3 or 4 miles out of Bryan, Texas as well. That's where they all settled, and most of the people that lived in that area for the years and years following are probably all distant cousins. There's a lot of names down in Bryan. The Bryan names themselves, some Edges, Clouds, Griffins, Joneses, and every once in a while I found out they were all kind of related to each other. So, anything else?
Well, and you went through the school system in Bryan?
Yes, I didn't get more than 100 miles away from Bryan fundamentally until I went to the Air Force. Went through, started school in the 1st grade in a Catholic school. I think Mom needed to get rid of me, but I lasted about a day. I think I've tried to walk home. I didn't like it very much. She started me a year early. And then the next year went to a school called Travis Elementary. Went there for about 2 years. And they built a new elementary school called Crockett, the Crockett Rockets. And then went to school at Crockett up until the 5th grade. Lamar Junior High School for about 3 years. At about that time, Dad, when they closed Bryan Air Force Base, Dad was without a job for a while. He got a job working for his brother-in-law, my mother's brother, who owned a lumber yard there. And he took his pay in lumber. He ended up building us a 1-room portable house that they moved up to the west side of Bryan. We lived there for a year, no water, no electricity, no gas, and outhouse. I thought it was pretty neat, except I didn't like the outhouse. That smelled pretty strong. And then they moved that house into between Bryan and College Station up on Cabot Drive, and we lived there for about a year while he was still looking for another job. And he did finally get a job as a chemical engineer working for Texas A&M Agriculture Department and the Research Department, working on processing meats and doing analysis on meats and vitamins in that area that I don't really recall very well. He had worked there for, I don't know, 8 years or so. We had moved in next door to my mother's parents. And the reason for that was that Dad came down with rheumatoid arthritis. He had an uncle who had come down with rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 20 and was bedridden from that point on through the rest of his life. And I remember we used to go visit him when I was a kid, and I thought he was scary. He was just so horribly deformed that it just scared me as a kid to even see him. And Mom was afraid that was going to happen to Dad, so she thought that we needed to get close to her family so that she could have some help taking care of Dad if that happened. And so they bought the lot next door. Dad built another house, and we started out with a one-room house again. And over the years, he kept adding to it and it kept growing. And but Mom's dad was an alcoholic, and they had a lot of problems in the family, had a lot of fights. And it was a love-hate relationship type of thing in the neighborhood, and always, it was bad for all the kids growing up, all the cousins that are about my age. We all had rough times with family feuds and fights. And so we'd move away every once in a while and then move back again. Mom could never get too far away, but when she lived there, she thought she needed to get away. Dad got a job again as an instrument mechanic for the Air Force up at James Connolly Air Force Base in Waco. We moved up there, and in the 9th grade, I was up there going to school called La Vega High School for a while. And then Mom, she had already had my sister Becky, but she was pregnant with Billy about that time. And I guess I must have been about 15 years old, because I'm 15 years older than Billy. And so she went back to Bryan to give birth to Billy, and we ended up moving back there again. We moved back in the same house again. So Dad went back to work for the oceanography department this time at Texas A&M, which turned out to be a pretty good job for him. He enjoyed that. And then later, I went to Texas A&M because it was the only school I could go to. I wasn't particularly fond of it at the time. I later became a gung-ho Aggie, but at the time, it was my last choice, but I couldn't afford to go anywhere else. They gave me a small little scholarship, and I could go there. And I had started to work at the oceanography department alongside Dad. I was washing test tubes, painting floors and things while I was in high school. Ended up having that job through college. And Dad got his master's degree in chemical oceanography at the same time I was going through school. And got to be good college buds. We'd spend a lot of time over at the Memorial Student Center at Texas A&M and drink coffee and talk. And that was the first time in many years that we'd gotten along. And, yeah, I guess I'd been a troublesome teenage kid growing up. So I think he had disowned me when I was about 12 years old or 14 years old, somewhere in that time frame. But he decided I wasn't so bad at that point.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
One sister and one brother.
Since your father was deaf, did you communicate with him being able to do lip reading, or?
He was pretty good at being able to read lips of the family. He never went to school for the deaf, which was probably a mistake. He never learned the two-handed sign language that the deaf used. We all learned very early on how to spell words on one hand, you know, with the single sign language where you actually spell out words. We all learned that when we were very young. And then he really preferred people to write. You know, he always carried a little tablet in his pocket, and he just preferred that you write to him. And he talked in a monotone, very low. He was very much aware that many deaf people talk too loud. And he had a low voice to begin with. And sometimes it was hard to understand him, and he'd get upset with you if you asked him to repeat words because he was afraid he was going to talk too loud. He was an interesting man, very smart man, very good man. Yeah.
Well, he must not have been born deaf then.
No, he can remember in his early life being able to hear women's voices. Don't ever remember being able to understand them. And I was told at one time that he had been kicked in the head by a mule, and that they thought that caused deafness. Someone else told me he had scarlet fever and thought that might have caused him to go deaf. Apparently many people thought he was just an imbecile when he was young before they realized that he was deaf. It took him a while to realize that. So, but he was a very smart man. Did a lot of reading all of his life, mostly science fiction books. He did a lot of reading all of his life. Yeah.
Did he get you interested in science fiction?
Oh, Lord, yes. Yeah. There was a time period in the summer times that I would read a science fiction pocketbook a day in the summertime. And then I graduated from that to Westerns later on, and I finally realized that science fictions and Westerns are pretty much the same, except one's on a rocket ship and one's on a horse. You know, so.
Were you a Ray Bradbury fan?
Yeah, I was early on, yes. Yeah, because that's what Dad, he read a lot of those, yeah. And read about all the dunes and the worms of the dunes and, you know.
And then the westerns, were you a Zane Grey fan, or?
I read some Zane Grey, but I never really got focused in on a particular brand of names. I just read what was available. I just go and get them. And in all my life, I find that I was paid very little attention to the details of who wrote what song or who sang the song or who wrote what book. I just would read it or listen to it, and if I liked it, I liked it. So I guess suffered from some kind of attention deficit disorder because I just wasn't too concerned about the details. You know, never was.
And so you graduated from A&M?
I graduated from A&M in 1963. My wife and I had gone to high school together. I met her in my senior year in high school. And we dated for 5 years and then got married when I graduated from Texas A&M. And at one point, at that time, A&M was an all-male school and it was mandatory core for the first 2 years. And then they would offer you a commission in the military service and pay you $28 a month if you signed up for it. And that made the difference of eating and not eating to me, so I signed up for it, plus they had the draft back in those days. So I was in the Corps through the 4 years at A&M. And then in my junior year, they came in and told me that I qualified to go to pilot training if I wanted to. And I had never thought about it, but it sounded exciting, so I signed up. And graduated from A&M, became a second lieutenant in the Air Force, and worked there at the oceanography for 3 months in the summer. And then on November '63, on Thanksgiving Day, I reported into Del Rio, Texas to start flight training for the Air Force.
What's the base at Del Rio?
Laughlin Air Force Base.
I'm trying to think of, is Fort Clark Springs down there?
I don't recall seeing it. It may well be, but there's a lot down there that we never saw, although you could see forever from. I had never seen that part of Texas. I grew up in the piney woods of Texas in the Bryan area. And I can remember my wife and I drove into Del Rio at night, and the next morning I looked out the window of the motel and it looked to me like I could see all the way back to San Antonio, which was 150 miles away. I'd never seen anything so flat and barren in all my life. It was just incredible.
And so you went through pilot training school?
Yes.
There?
Yes, I did.
And then after you left Del Rio, where did you go?
Well, I went through some additional training at James Conley for a while, and then I ended up flying C-123s at Hamilton Air Force Base near San Francisco. I can remember we were waiting for orders after graduation, and we didn't care where we went. We just didn't want to go to California because we'd heard strange things about those people in California. Didn't want to go, and sure enough, we got orders to California, and then of all places to San Francisco. And drove into town the first day and got lost trying to drive up those hills in San Francisco with a standard shift car, burned out a clutch trying to hold at a stop sign on the top of a hill and shift into gears and go forward without sliding the guy behind me. Hated the place for about 3 days. Hated it a lot hard. And it only took about 3 days to start turning me around. And of course, you can't live out there for very long without falling in love with San Francisco or that area. Just incredibly beautiful. Just wonderful. And we lived there for 9 months for Vietnam. Went to Vietnam flying caribous in Vietnam.
What kind of aircraft were you flying in Vietnam?
Caribou, C-7, the Air Force calls it, and I think the Army called it a CV-2. The Army had a large, for them, fixed-wing aircraft. It's small by Air Force standards. It looks like a C-130 type of an aircraft, but a very small two-engine version. Carries about 30 passengers. It'll carry a Jeep and a howitzer. Has a ramp on the back end so you can drive up and off of it. And it was built by de Havilland in Canada, and the Army bought it, and they used it like a 2.5-ton truck. If the weather was too bad, the roads too muddy to fly in with, to come in with a truck, they'd fly in with a Caribou and deliver the cargo. And the Air Force apparently, and this was all unbeknownst to me, I was a young second lieutenant at the time, but the Air Force got very upset with the fact that the Army was starting to rebuild their Air Force. You know, they started out with the U.S. Army Air Corps. And so they went to Congress and the President, and they got some kind of an agreement that prohibited the Army from having these large fixed-wing aircraft. And in return, they gave the Army operations of a lot of helicopters that the Air Force had been doing up to that point in time. And the Caribous were already deployed in Vietnam. They had Army pilots. They had, I think, 6 companies of them flying over there. And I got called in. I was the most ineligible person in the unit to be reassigned. I'd only been on the base for 9 months, but I got called in. They told me I was going to Vietnam, which at the time, I can remember some of the older officers were going over there, and the officers in our outfit were going there, flying what they called Puff the Magic Dragon, which was the at that time, it was C-47 aircraft that were armed with miniguns, and they fly at night and go into firefight areas. And it was a scary kind of an operation, and the old officers talked about it a lot, and it had me scared to death. And I can remember feeling guilty every time somebody got orders for Vietnam. I felt so relieved it wasn't me, and I felt guilty because I felt that way. Started talking to my wife and telling her that, you know, I was going to go sooner or later. I think I'd just like to volunteer and get this over with. And she understood that. So I was about to volunteer, but they beat me to the punch. They sit me over there for the audit. Told me I was going in Caribous, and I thought they were kidding me because I knew it was an Army aircraft. And they told me I'd be going to Fort Benning, which was an Army base, to check out the Caribou, which I did. And it turned out there were 3 of us that went over there at the same time. We went through checkout down at Fort Benning, Georgia. Most of the other folks that were on their way over there in that unit had to go through survival school at Stead. I had already done that, so that sent us over a month or 2 earlier than most of the other folks. Did stop and go through survival school in the Philippines on the way, which was a short course. It was like a 1-week survival course on surviving in the jungles. Very good school. They had negritos, as they called them. It was a kind of a pygmy folks that lived in the mountains of the Philippines. I had never ever been familiar with them. They wore loincloths and filed their teeth to points. You know, they didn't speak English, but they sure knew how to live in the jungle. They knew how to build traps, from catching birds to killing men. It was just, and they showed you those, showed you how to get water out of trees, showed you how to find food in the ground. And it was an incredibly good survival school. And then went to Vietnam. We were the first 3 Air Force pilots to show up there that were going to be flying the Caribous. And they told us that we were assigned to a unit attached to the 1st Cavalry. And we asked them where it was, and they said they didn't know. They said there was a courier flight leaving that afternoon. They'd stop at a lot of bases flying around. Said, go get on that flight, and when you find the unit, call us back and we'll cut your order sending you there. So we flew all over the country trying to find this place. And we got off at Nha Trang. I can remember thinking we had found it because we saw a sign that said it was a site that was very familiar. The name, I don't remember what the name was, 537th or 517th or something. But anyway, it was 17th Aviation Company. But we saw a sign that we thought was it. We unloaded our bags, went running in and said, we're here. And they said, who are you? And we said, we're the new Air Force pilots. They said, we don't have any Air Force pilots. Yeah, we're here to fly your Caribous. We don't have any Caribous. We just have helicopters. We ran back out there, plane jumped on it again, went running off, flying a couple more stops until we finally found someone that knew where this operation was. It was at Camp Holloway, which was a funny little camp between An Khie and Pleiku in Vietnam. So we found home there for the U.S. Army, which turned out to be a very interesting assignment. You know, the Army flew planes differently from the way we did in the Air Force. They used them as trucks. You know, we used them as airlines. It was a fascinating experience.
What year was that?
I think that was 1966. I think that was the year. It was either 65 or 66, but I think it was 66, about July of 66.
And how long were you in Vietnam?
I was there for a year, left in July the following year. We were at Camp Holloway for not too long. And then that whole unit moved over to An Khie, which was where the 1st Cavalry Division was located. This was just shortly after the big battle that the 1st Cav had first gone into. We were still flying into the same area over there. Can't remember the name of it. I know that the airstrip we called Oasis, which was the strip that was south of Pleiku that we were always flying in. It just seemed like every other week they'd call a tactical emergency, and we'd start carrying troops in there in the middle of the night. There were no lights or anything. They'd light a couple of fires at the end of this little dirt strip, and we'd fly into that. And there'd be a heavy firefight going on almost every time we go in there at nighttime. You wanted to make sure you landed at the end of the runway where the enemy was, so that when you stopped, you were in the friendly zone of the runway, you know. And we carry in a lot of ammunition, troops, carry wounded and dead out back home. It seemed like just every other week we're going back in there. They get it under control, start pulling troops out of there and move them somewhere else, and then the VC would start moving back into that area again. So it was a never-ending battle going on.
So when you were landing at night, they just had fires like in a smudge pot, or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite often just a little smudge pot on each side of the runway. That's what you'd see. I can remember one night we were going into another, I think it's called Hammond Strip, which was kind of a little 900-foot dirt strip pushed up in the middle of a rice paddy. It was just covered with water all around it. And I saw two lights, and you'd go in with your lights off because they'd hear you and they'd start shooting at nighttime. And the sky looked like it would just turn a flaming red with tracer bullets, and you knew that if you saw tracers, you're only seeing every third or 10th, depending how they load them up. And it's scary. You know, I remember I'd get so scared going into those things that times I couldn't talk. But you couldn't see how you could fly through there and survive, much less not get hit. Typically we'd do it and not get hit. I just never understood that. But and we'd go in with the lights off. Just before you touch down, you turn the lights on, the landing lights on, so you could see what was in front of you. And I remember one night I went in there and I saw two little fires, and I thought they were the smudge pots, and came in for a landing, and I was in my flare for touchdown and turned on the landing lights. And when I did, it turned out that fire was at the end of 2 rows of tents, and there were guys out in the middle there looking up at me where they were out eating their sea rations at night. And it wasn't the strip. Scared both them and me. Yeah, interesting times.
After you left Vietnam and you were there for a year,
Mm-hmm.
What did you do?
Well, I was there at Anke for up until January, and in January of that year, the unit actually moved over to become an Air Force unit. So we moved over to a new base they were building called Phuket, and that was a large base. They still had not completed the runway. We were flying off of a dirt road over at Phuket. Left there and came back to the States. I was assigned to Mather Air Force Base in California, Sacramento area, flying navigator training missions. Mostly what they were doing was they were training weapons officers for backseat of F-4s and fighter aircraft. And absolutely hated the job. We were flying missions that take 10 to 12 hours a day. We were flying 6 days a week. And one day you'd take off in the morning and fly for 10 hours, 12 hours. The next day you take off at noon. The next day you take off at midnight or something. So the navigators were getting day experience and nighttime experience. Flew the same routes day after day after day. It got so boring. I absolutely hated it. Tried to resign from the Air Force, but I was a regular officer, and they told me I was frozen for a year. I couldn't get out because of the Vietnam War. And somewhere along towards the end of that first year there, I got a call and asked me if I would be interested in being an aide de camp for a general commanding officer, which I had never had any desire to do. I always thought aides were kind of gold brickers. But I was looking for a way out of this job, and I said, where is the job and who is it? And they told me it was a guy named Bertrand C. Harrison, who was 6th ATAF commander for NATO in Turkey. And so I called my wife and asked her what she thought, and she had lived in Saudi Arabia as a kid with her dad and lived in Baghdad for a while. And she thought that would be pretty interesting, so I told them I'd take the job. And they gave me, it was an incredibly short period of time. It seemed like they gave me less than 3 weeks till I had a report date over in Turkey. And I remember we ended up getting 17 shots in one day, and my wife and I both, and she packed the house within 24 hours, and we were on our way. You know, so. And as I went across there, I had never heard of Bertram Harrison. He'd never heard of me for sure. He picked my name out of some folders that they'd sent to him, I guess. We'd stop and visit with some of our Air Force friends across the way, and they'd ask me what I was doing. And I said, well, I'm going to be an aide to this General Austin. They said, who? I said, General Harrison. And someone would look at me and say, not Bertram C. Harrison. And I'd say, oh, yeah, you know him. I said, oh, you poor son of a bitch. And they were right. Turned out he was the hatchet man for General LeMay. And I don't know if you know General LeMay or not, but LeMay was the originator of the